Afternoon, guys, evening, whenever you're listening to this. So, welcome to this kind of pre recorded online revision lesson. I hope it's going to be of some use to you. So, the focus for this afternoon, obviously, is just Unit 1. We'll do a separate Unit 2 lesson after half term. And the purpose, really, of this revision lesson is just to pick out certain parts of the specification with a view to looking at some potential exam questions, planning those questions. So there'll be lots of opportunities for you during this lesson to hit the pause button and go away and plan some questions, or at least plan some questions for AO1, plan some questions for AO3. Now, it goes without saying, it's an incredibly large specification, takes in a vast chunk of history, so it is impossible to go through everything. What I have done, is looked at the previous questions that have come up in recent years, perhaps looking at those areas of the specification that came up, 4 or 5 years ago, or haven't really been assessed too much. So, for the first part of this lesson, we're going to cover the period 1851 to 1886. And we're going to have a real emphasis on looking at the political developments that occurred under Gladstone and Disraeli. So the emergence of the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party's basis of support under Disraeli, and then of course the extension of the franchise in 1867 and 1884. So let's get started. Let's get straight in. So this is content that we covered a very, very long time ago. It is an area of the specification that has been under-assessed, so there's a good chance it might come up in some form, be it as an extract question or as an actual essay question. So the question is as follows. The emergence of liberalism in the years 1851 to 1874 was due to support for free trade. Now, you've been asked to assess the validity of this view. So as always, when we're planning a question, we need to do a table, evidence to support the statement, evidence to challenge the statement, look at how the evidence balances out, and that will inform the overall judgment that you will reach. So at this point, I'd like you to hit the pause button and give yourself 5 minutes to put a quick plan together. This is something that we haven't looked at for quite some time, so it may well be that you're thinking, I've completely forgotten all of this, which obviously with the exam literally just around the corner, you'll need to remedy. So give yourself 5 minutes, hit the pause button now. Okay, so hopefully you've had 5 minutes to at least have a think about this question. So let's compare answers. What content would we want to deploy to this type of question? Well, evidence to support the statement that free trade was the most, or the liberal commitment to free trade was the most important factor in explaining the emergence of liberalism and a liberal party. So what evidence is there to support the statement? Well, if you look at the composition of the Liberal Party in the late 1850s when they came together, many of the leading Liberal politicians, such as Gladstone, were Peelites. Now, the Peelites were former Conservatives who had split from the Tory party in support of Robert Peel's tariff reforms, most notably, of course, the repeal of the Corn Laws. So, although this predates our period a little bit, it is important to bear that in mind. So, the Peelites were, of course, supporters of free trade because they supported Peel's repeal or abolition of the old Corn Laws. Other Liberals at the time, leading Liberals, of course, was the Radical MP John Bright, who had also been a founding member and a very, very influential member of the Anti-Corn Law League, which was a pressure group set up to petition for the abolition of the Corn Laws. Many liberals, of course, many liberal MPs, of course, came from middle class and commercial backgrounds who strongly believed in the principles and policies of free trade. And of course, under Gladstone, a key component of liberal policy or liberal ideology was underpinned by the whole notion of laissez-faire, don't interfere, and free trade. Now, what evidence would there be to challenge the statement in the interest of balance? Well, you might have got that the emergence of modern liberalism can also be attributed to other reasons. Okay, so there's the religious angle. Many liberals were drawn from the ranks of religious dissenters or nonconformists who believed that there should be a complete separation of church and state. And the more radical liberals again opposed the political domination of the landowning classes. So John Bright was also, very much from that radical tradition that was pushing for an extension of the franchise. You could also argue that liberalism also has its links to the political philosophies of the time, like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, who believed very strongly in individual liberty and the freedom of the individual in a parliamentary democracy under a limited state. And we can see that influence very much in Gladstonian liberalism, the idea of peace, retrenchment, and reform. So retrenchment means, if you remember, a cutback in government spending and a rolling back of the frontiers of the state. So this belief in minimal government. Okay, quite a tough one, isn't it? Because it is focusing on content that we covered right at the very beginning of the A level. So, but this is a 2-year course, and there's absolutely no reason whatsoever why the examiners wouldn't choose that type of question. So it is one to be prepared for. Okay, we're not going to have time to go through the next couple of slides. This is an AO3 exercise. It's looking at the basis of the conservative support up until the 1860s under Lord Derby and Disraeli. So if you have time, please complete the planning exercise at the very least. Just again, with our synthesis triangle, breaking down the main argument of the historian and any supporting arguments and supporting evidence. So obviously that's from an AS paper, so there was only 2 extracts. As you know, in the full A-level paper there are 3 extracts, and it's just a reminder here of how you go about tackling that question. So it should be obvious from the planning table that you'll need to have 1 paragraph analysing the argument, so identifying the core argument, identifying the supporting arguments, identifying the supporting evidence, and then at least 1 paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs on the evaluation. What are the strengths and merits of the arguments the historian has made? What are the strengths of the main argument? What are the strengths of these perhaps supporting arguments? And then what are the weaknesses? Are there any weaknesses in the historian's main argument? Are there any flaws in the supporting arguments? Has the historian been correct to draw the conclusions from the evidence presented? So that's the type of thing you'll need to be thinking about. So as you know, you've got 60 minutes on that question, but 15 minutes, of course, to go through the extracts with a fine-tooth comb, and of course, your planning. You must plan all your answers and show the examiner evidence of your planning. Okay, we're now going to focus on the extension of the franchise and parliamentary reform. So I've included on the presentation a breakdown of some of the reasons why the government of the time, under the Liberals of course, but also under Lord Derby and Disraeli and the Conservative Party, why extension of the franchise, in other words, extending the vote to more people, why reform of elections and Parliament, why had it become an issue again by 1867. So there's a range of different factors there. Hopefully this is ringing some bells. So this question targets parliamentary reform in the years from 1857 to 1885. So to what extent did parliamentary reform in the years between 1857 to 1885 improve democracy in Britain? Again, I'd like you to put together a little planning table. Your left-hand column for submitting the evidence or identifying the evidence that you could submit to say to agree with the assertion in the question that yes, parliamentary reforms did improve democracy in Britain, and then on the right-hand side your counter arguments to identify, in other words, some of the anti-democratic features that still remained in the UK. The dates are not random or arbitrary. The dates, I have chosen the dates to carefully guide you towards looking at some of the significant reforms that took place in Parliament between 1857 to 1885. So, just as we did a few minutes ago, I'd like you to pause the video now and spend 5 minutes completing a quick plan. And then when you've done that, hit play again and we'll come back and compare notes. Okay, so hopefully you've had at least 5 minutes to put together a potential plan for this question. So let's have a look together now. Let's compare notes and see what content could be submitted in a good answer to this question. Okay, now I can't actually see that from my from the view I've got on the webcam, so I'm just going to go to the actual PowerPoint so I can see what I've written a bit more easily. Okay, so arguments in favour of parliamentary reform improving democracy include, but are not limited to, the 1867 bill, as we know, was actually more radical, or the final bill was far more radical than it was originally intended to be under Gladstone. So the radical MP in Parliament, George Hodgkinson, ensured that an amendment was attached to the bill that meant that working class men in the boroughs who rented property qualified for the vote. So this meant for the first time that the right to vote was no longer predicated on the ownership of property. So that it was far more radical than it was originally intended to be. Now, similarly, in 1884, the Third Reform Act extended the vote to men in the counties on the same terms as had been given to the borough householders in 1867. Now, so tellingly, what that meant, of course, was that the total male electorate had risen in 1884 to 5.5 million compared to 2.5 million in 1867. So there was a significant expansion of the amount of people who were allowed to vote. You could talk about the Ballot Act in 1872 and the Corrupt and Illegal Practices Act passed in 1883, which of course all but eliminated bribery, intimidation and coercion, because people could now vote in secret. And of course the Corrupt and Illegal Practices Act, put strict limits on the amount of money that could be spent in elections to make elections fairer. Significantly, the abolition of the property qualification in 1857 opened the way for working class men to become members of Parliament. So to be an MP, you no longer had to own property. So that was another significant step forward. You can also talk about the redistribution of seats. So by 1885, there had been a concerted move to the creation of fairer and more equal constituencies under the Redistribution of Seats Act of 1885, and give some examples of the type of constituencies that lost MPs and the type of constituencies that gained MPs in order to support that point. Your counter-argument might include a significant proportion of the male population was still not allowed to vote, of course, and that included men who did not have a fixed address, which of course was a lot of working men at the time. Women, as we know, remained completely excluded from the franchise. And even up to 1885, the distribution of seats did not correspond to the size of the population. So what that meant in practice, at least until 1885, is that rural areas, particularly in the south and east, remained vastly overrepresented, but the industrial centres remained vastly underrepresented. So, on the one hand, working class men in the boroughs in 1867 were given the right to vote. But the way the constituencies were organised, the sizes of constituencies and the size of the representation kind of offset that somewhat. And the more rural areas were vastly overrepresented. So, in other words, some votes counted more than others, and that still was unfair. The House of Lords, of course, at this point remained completely unreformed and was a bastion of conservatism. So even when the Conservatives were out of power, they were still able to frustrate Liberal governments by blocking a lot of their legislation. Okay, and you could also counter the fact that yes, the property qualification for MPs was abolished. However, there was still no salary for being an MP. It was an incredibly expensive full-time job. So there's some good arguments and there's some good counter arguments. You can see from the balance of the evidence that I think overall you could make a compelling case to argue in favour of the reforms in Parliament had improved democracy. It's a to what extent question. So yes, there were a lot of anti-democratic features still present, but in the context of the time, significant strides towards democracy had been taken, and I think that again is reflected in the balance of the evidence, isn't it? Okay, so when you're doing your essays, do think about how you're structuring your paragraphs. So as I've said to you many times, try to make sure that each paragraph is structured almost kind of like a mini essay, and that it has a good opening sentence which tells the examiner clearly what particular factor is under consideration in that paragraph. I call it signposting. Make it absolutely clear what factor you're going to be discussing in that paragraph and how it's developing your overall case. Okay, so obviously you start with a nice big point, as it were, a good signpost. You then supply some evidence to advance the argument being made. Really good paragraphs. It's not always possible to do this, but oftentimes it is. Really good paragraphs will also, like the essay itself, have an element of balance, and you might argue one point and then show a conflicting viewpoint. But of course, not to the detriment of the overall case you're making. So you show the counter arguments, but you still ultimately show that the case you're arguing it holds. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's have a look at the plan. If you go back to the plan, and let's take one of the points in the plan. So so let's take the point of the abolition of the property qualification, 1857. So overall, in this paragraph, you're going to argue that by abolishing the property qualification, this was a massive step forward to allow, eventually over time, working class men to become members of Parliament. This was the abolition of the property qualification was one of the 6 points of the People's Charter, and over time it did it. It paved the way for many ordinary people to become MPs, particularly when the new unions got going. They used the mass subscription funds to fund the work of working class MPs. So a notable example of that would be Keir Hardie, of course, who went on to establish the Independent Labour Party. So it was a leap in the dark, as they described these changes at the time. Now, in that same paragraph, though, you could look, at the counter argument in that, its effectiveness was curtailed by the fact that MPs at this point, didn't receive a salary. So it still, the majority of working class people were still excluded to some extent from running as MPs. However, as I've said, that was also offset by the fact that, by the 1880s, the mass subscription trade unions had got going, and they used the subscription funds to fund the activities of working class MPs. So, just have that element of balance in your answer. But ultimately, you're still making the case that, parliamentary reform, did improve democracy to a great extent. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now the good paragraph should also, following on from that, you should have a mini judgment at the end of the paragraph. Overall, the abolition of the property qualification for MPs paved the way for many working class men to become MPs, particularly with the funding available from the trade unions. So that's your kind of your mini judgment. And as I said to you, if your judgment is absolutely spelled out in your introduction, if you've nailed down the case you're going to argue, if every paragraph then does a job and develops that case, always looking at, in the interest of balance, looking at the potential sort of yes, to a large extent in this question, parliamentary reform improved democracy. However, there were other, things that needed to improve. If that is explicit throughout the question, then it makes that last concluding paragraph simply a case of, it's just a summary, isn't it? A concluding paragraph then is a summary of the argument that you've already made, because your judgment has been sustained throughout the whole answer, rather than trying to bolt on a judgment at the very end of the answer. So that's really important in terms of, we know the mark scheme is looking for substantiated judgment, but if your judgment is absolutely apparent in your introduction, in your main body, okay, that I would suggest is how you really push into the mark scheme for sustained judgment, because it's been sustained throughout the question and you haven't simply waited for 3 or 4 sentences at the end, to arrive at that judgment. Okay, so there's a sample paragraph here. Can you improve the paragraph here by introducing a line of argument against reform improving democracy, but still holding the overall line or argument in favour of the statement in the question? So in other words, parliamentary reform did improve democracy. Okay, I'm not sure how much time you've got. If you have time, by all means, please have a go at trying to introduce some balance to that paragraph. Okay, so we arrived at part 2, and we're going to be looking at the period 1886 to 1914, challenges to the status quo. So let's have a go at planning another question, this time on the topic of the rise of the labour movement. So the question here is, in the years 1884 to 1905, so up to the creation of the Labour Party, the labour movement was a weak vehicle for the political aspirations or ambitions of the working classes. Assess the validity of this view. So once again, hit pause, give yourself 5 minutes and put together a quick plan, a balanced plan for that question. And when you've done it, click play and we'll come back and compare answers. Okay, so hopefully you had 5 minutes to have a go at least thinking about that question. So let's compare notes. And again, I'll have to look at the actual presentation because I can't see too well on this webcam. So, labour movement. So really what this question is about, of course, is the is the development of what became the Labour Party by 1905. So let's have a look at the evidence to support the statement. Well, first of all, you could argue that, um, yeah, the Labour movement was a weak vehicle for, working class political ambitions. We only have to look at the election results of the Independent Labour Party under Keir Hardie. In the 1895 elections, they were only able to field 28 candidates and they gained no seats. Other left-wing organisations like the Social Democratic Federation, these Marxist organisations, were completely divided in their aims. Some favouring, gradual change, others favouring violent revolution, and they'd all but fizzled out by the 1890s. The Fabian Society, you could argue, was run by mostly middle class, what I call champagne socialists. It was set up by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, was a famous member. And yes, they did lots of speeches outside factory gates and issued lots of leaflets, but they could hardly be described as a decent vehicle for working class aspirations. And in any case, we know the Fabian Society were playing the long game, gradual change and the gradual sort of infiltration of democracy. Now, the Trade Union Congress, the Independent Labour Party had all come together to form the Labour Representation Committee so that they could have a more united and stronger influence in Parliament. And even by the time they'd actually become the Labour Party, we only have to look at the election results to see that they still didn't do particularly well. So, for example, in the 1906 election, they were able to only gain 28 seats. Evidence to challenge the statement, you could talk about the Lib Lab Electoral Pact. This was an electoral pact agreed in 1903, of course, where Liberal candidates would not stand against Labour candidates who had a chance of winning a seat in that constituency, and vice versa. You could also dig deeper into the 1906 election, and actually, when you do that, it's clear the Labour had done actually quite well. They were only actually able to field 50 candidates in that general election. So the 28 seats they did gain is actually a significant achievement. And one could argue from 1906, Labour was now the fourth most supported party in Parliament, of course, behind the Liberals, behind the Conservatives, the Irish Nationalists, and then there was Labour. We could also argue, of course, that at this point, Labour's performance in elections needs to be understood within the context of a limited franchise. Not all men can still vote. And we know women were totally excluded from the franchise, and many working class women went on to become, loyal Labour supporters. However, another counter argument, you could say that the formation of a Labour Party in 1905 meant now that the Conservatives and Liberals could no longer ignore working class needs, not if they didn't want to lose votes to this newly formed Labour Party. And when you look at the Liberal government's programme of welfare reform from 1906, arguably a lot of that was driven through the fear of losing support to the Labour Party. And the Free School Meals Act for children was a private member's bill introduced by Keir Hardie that the Liberals basically the Liberal government passed it and took credit for it. Okay, so those are just some of the the things you could have mentioned in that essay. Again, for this, you can see the balance of the evidence is kind of tilted in favour of actually the Labour movement was not a particularly weak vehicle for working class aspirations, although clearly they still had a long way to go before they could, what became the Labour Party could challenge the two main parties. Now, the extracts here focuses on the emergence of new liberalism. Again, we haven't got time to go through this as such, but this dovetails quite nicely with what we've just been talking about because, for example, Paul Alderman's argument in his book, you can see there the rise of the Labour Party. He's arguing and quite convincingly actually, that again, I'll just have to go into the actual PowerPoint so I can see. Yeah, he says here, so the lead in social reform was taken over by Lloyd George and Winston Churchill to revitalise the Liberal Party and reduce the appeal of socialism. Okay, the Liberal programme of social legislation placed the Labour MPs in an unenviable situation. Their support for the Liberal bills only outlined the absence of any viable Labour alternatives and tied the Labour Party even more closely to the Liberal Party. The skill with which Lloyd George destroyed the initial trade union suspicions of his National Insurance Bill, so the National Insurance for Sickness and Unemployment Insurance in 1911, it says it was a victory of the highest order and first and foremost a victory over the Labour Party. So, in other words, what he's arguing is that the Labour Party, the very existence of a Labour Party at this point, was quite frightening for the Liberals. And Lloyd George and Churchill knew that if they were not going to be eclipsed by the Labour Party, then they had to tackle the urgent need of social reform. So that's a very interesting perspective there. Yeah, that's one to do perhaps in your own time. Now, we're going to switch our focus to the economy. Okay, so here we go. The period 1873 to 1914, which is of course what we're looking at the moment. So to what extent did the strengths of the British economy outweigh its weaknesses in the years between 1886 to 1914? Once again, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, so press the pause button, go away for 5 minutes and put together a quick plan for this question, and then we'll come back as usual and compare notes. Okay, well, hopefully you've had a chance to plan that. So, without further ado, let's compare notes. So, what were the strengths of the British economy between 1886 and 1914? Well, you could come at it from the perspective, the historiography, and that the idea that there was a Great Depression at this time. It was largely a myth, and that actually the economy was strong. And this can be evidenced in the following. So, exports of coal, machinery and shipping were actually predominant at this time, stimulating growth in heavy industry. So those heavy industry was doing particularly well. There have been, of course, linking into that, successful innovations in steel production. So the Bessemer process, the Gilchrist-Thomas technique, which was a technique of manufacturing steel from iron ore with a high phosphorus content, kind of revolutionized and really sped up steel production. Contrary to what some historians have argued, there have been developments in the new industries of chemicals and electricity. And the examples you could provide there were the Lever brothers set up a soap manufacturing company. An electrical generating station was built in Holborn, and the first electric tube train, believe it or not, was unveiled in London at this time. Now, further evidence on the next slide would be, of course, that Britain's balance of payments remained in surplus by 1914, thanks to the strength rather of Britain's invisible earnings. So we know that invisible earnings such as banking, insurance, income from overseas assets offset Britain's balance of trade issues. Britain remained a creditor nation. The City of London was, of course, the financial centre of the world. Now, I think you're going to see, by and large, that the arguments pointing to the weaknesses rather of the British economy tend to outweigh the strengths. Now, you could argue very convincingly that claims that there were a Great Depression, reflected the contemporary attitudes and fears of the time. And, there was absolutely no doubt a severe depression in agriculture. So, cheap imports from the USA and other nations had a severe impact on British farmers. We know that the canning process meant that beef that was coming from as far afield as South America, such as Argentina, Uruguay, even New Zealand, the other side of the world could be exported to Britain. By 1889, 40% of the meat consumed in Britain came from farmers abroad. This meant that many farmers in England went bankrupt, and as a result, many agricultural workers were forced to emigrate to the USA. The exports of coal, machinery, and shipping, or actually, so although we've said that coal, machinery, and shipping, this was an area of strength of the British economy. We can flip that around and develop a counter argument, because by exporting all this heavy machinery, to places abroad, it meant that we were storing up problems for the future, because we were providing other nations quite literally with the tools with which to industrialize and challenge Britain's economic position. You could argue on the next slide that the economy remained too dependent on the old staple industries. British manufacturers were falling behind their competitors even in this field, thanks to this third generation syndrome. So the grandchildren of the original sort of entrepreneurs and pioneers had grown fat off the profits of their forebears, and were not dynamic or innovative, and as a result things were stagnating. And I think many historians would argue that Britain had been way too slow to embrace the new industries of chemicals and electricity in particular, and as a result they'd fallen way behind their rivals such as America and Germany. Now, again, the Royal Commission launched by Prime Minister Salisbury in 1886, this was an inquiry into the problems in the economy, an official government inquiry, and it revealed that there had been a significant decline in demand for British goods abroad. Now, this, of course, was basically, on the next slide, it tells you that this was, leading to, as we know, a balance of trade issue. So, in other words, Britain was now importing more goods than it was importing, and that was storing up significant problems for the future. And the last point, I think, is a very important one. There was this whole debate over protectionism at the time, and that is evidence over the concern over declining British exports. Now, we know that laissez-faire free trade was, a domineering political economic ideology, and it was clung to stubbornly by successive governments. But under Joseph Chamberlain, who of course had defected to the Conservatives over Home Rule in 1886, he put forward the idea of an imperial tariff to create a Tax Britannicus. In other words, create a trading bloc within the countries of the British Empire, and any country exporting goods to the empire would have to pay a tariff. And of course, the whole debate over protectionism brought down Balfour's government, and was one of the reasons why the Conservatives were so roundly thrashed in the 1906 election. So that in itself is evidence that there was big concerns that the policy of free trade was detrimental to the British economy. Okay, so you can see there that I think there's a real case to be made that the weaknesses of the British economy far outweighed the strengths. So there's a model introduction that you can have a look at here. Okay, so an introduction should always, like your essay, should be balanced. It should, these are the overall. This is the judgment I'm making. These, in this case, there were some very clear weaknesses in the British economy that were storing up significant problems for the future. However, on the other hand, there were some strengths that we will also consider as well. But it should be clear, on balance, overall, you're going to make the case that the strengths did outweigh the weaknesses, or so rather, no, beg your pardon, the weaknesses outweigh the strengths. Okay, you've seen these extracts before, but all good revision material on the state of the British economy in this period. So again, if you get time, perhaps just take one of the extracts and have a go at just extrapolating, the main argument, the supporting argument, and the supporting evidence. So we're going to switch our focus now to social reform, government social policy. So the social reforms I've said of successive British governments in the period of 1890 to 1911 did little to help the condition of the working classes. So how valid is this view? Now, for this question, again, I'm just going to get it up on my actual PowerPoint so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so what I've done the evidence to challenge the statement on the right hand side. So if you were going to challenge that statement, obviously you could argue that, well, the Housing Act passed by Salisbury's Conservative government in 1890 created the first what we'd recognise as council houses for working people. Stipulation, of course, was that those houses must have fresh running water and an outside toilet. Public health legislation or innovations in public health meant that most towns and cities now had access to clean water, safe drainage systems, proper sewage systems to dispose of waste. In terms of education, we know that the Education Act of 1902, set up by Prime Minister Balfour, of course, who has succeeded Salisbury, established state responsibility for secondary education, placing secondary education under the control of local government. So that was a big step forward to what we'd recognise as a kind of a uniform, government-led education system. Now, this type of question, of course, you have to look at the social welfare reformers or the New Liberals. We know that many historians would argue that they laid the foundation of a welfare state by passing, they passed legislation for children, which included the Free School Meals Act, which meant that in many schools, poor children had at least one decent meal a day. They introduced medical inspections for children in schools. They introduced a children's charter, which, amongst other things, made parents legally responsible for the upkeep of their children. For the elderly, of course, they introduced old age pensions, 5 shillings a week to those elderly people, I should say, over the age of 70. They introduced sickness insurance for some workers, so you were entitled to up to a period of 16 weeks. It was, oh goodness me, my brain's gone. 10 shillings a week, wasn't it, for 26 weeks. Unemployment insurance, 7 shillings a week for 15 weeks, I think it was. So these reforms, must be seen in the context of the time. They were very much, a leap forward. So the ills of unemployment and injury and sickness and old age were now being dealt with for the very first time by a new Liberal government that had a far more interventionist, outlook. Now, what would be the evidence to actually validate the statement that these reforms did little to help the condition of the working classes? This is something I want you to have a go at on your own now. But I've got you started. Have a think about, particularly when you're looking at the reforms, look at the ideology underpinning them. These were governments that were still who believed in minimal government, minimal state interference, laissez-faire. And we can see that very much, not just in the conservative social reforms of the 1890s, but even in the new Liberal welfare reforms, because many of these reforms were adoptive. So that meant they were not compulsory. So with the free school meals, for example, we know overall about 100,000 children benefited from the scheme across the UK. Many local authorities chose not to adopt it. Okay, you can look at pensions and look at, well, actually the age, the qualifying age for 70. The average life expectancy for a man at this point was around 58, 60. I think women 65. So many people wouldn't have lived long enough to actually qualify for the pension. If you're talking about sickness insurance, it only covered the worker, didn't cover the rest of the family. unemployment insurance only covered workers in certain industries, particularly those that suffer from cyclical unemployment. So there's a lot there that you could use to challenge the statement in the question. Okay, so we're going to move on to the penultimate part of the specification now. So looking at the interwar years, looking at the period from 1914 to 1939. Now, this question, you had a go at planning that the other week, so I've just replicated it here. Hopefully, you've got a plan together for that. This type of question, I haven't seen it come up at all, really, and it is an important part of the specification. So I see no reason why something like this, couldn't come up this year. So make sure you are prepared for a question on sort of, this is still very much in the context of political developments in the interwar years. Okay, so this question then, the economy and living standards in the interwar year period. So I'm just going to get that up on my actual PowerPoint so I can see what I'm talking about. So this is a potential question. To what extent can the interwar period be described as one of depression and poverty? So this is a question that really deals with two themes, isn't it? It's dealing with the economy, and it's also dealing with the impact of the economy on people's standards of living. So factors you could include in any response to this question would be, well, we know that after the First World War, Britain had lost vital markets, which of course had made worse or exacerbated the problems of British industry, especially the old staples. We know that mining was badly affected, and the government ownership of the mines in the war had only papered over the cracks, and when the mines were handed back to private ownership, poor industrial relations ensued because the owners of the industries wanted to make the workers work more hours for less money, and all of that led to the outbreak of the general strike in 1926. We know that Britain's ties to the gold standard during this period set the pound way too high against the dollar, which led rather to a collapse in the demand for British goods. Unemployment, as we know, hit frightening levels in the wake of the global economic depression of 1929. The staples were hit hard, and as we know, the government had to grant aid to the depressed areas through, if you remember, the Special Areas Act of 1934. But as we know, it wasn't all doom and gloom. The growth of new industries in the southeast and Midlands, in those areas at least, from 1934 resulted in improving living standards and the beginnings of what we would recognise as modern consumerism. The march of the pylons brought electricity into people's homes, and this, of course, led to a demand in new consumer items such as radio sets and vacuum cleaners and refrigerators and various other things. We know that the sale of cars also increased. Lots of new homes were built in the southeast at this point. And, in terms of holidays, the first Butlins holiday camps were opened up for the more affluent working class families. So it comes back, doesn't it, to this whole issue of lottery by postcode. So I've included that extract that we spent some time in lessons looking at in terms of, when we talk of the economic problems of the 1930s, we have to be very specific about what part of the country we're talking about. Yes, there were some parts of the country that experienced appalling levels of poverty, particularly from 1929 to 1934. But other parts of the country, that wasn't the case at all. And as we've seen, we are seeing the emergence of a kind of a consumer orientated economy underpinned by light industry that was, in some areas of the country, resulting in a massive improvement in living standards, which, as we know, was interrupted by the outbreak of the Second World War. Okay, so the last part then. Okay, transformation and change, looking at the period from 1939 to 1964. And so, again, I'll get it up on my actual PowerPoint. Okay, so political developments, and it's something that we covered only a couple of months ago, wasn't it? So here's a good question for you. The Conservatives dominated the period 1951 to 1964 because of their commitment to the post-war consensus. Assess the validity of this view. Now, you can go away after this recording is finished and plan this answer on your own. But, again, a balanced plan which will lead to a balanced argument and a balanced judgment. But I've given you some things to think about here. So your answer could include an appreciation that yes, in support of the conceit in the question, the Conservative acceptance of the post-war consensus of both the Conservatives and Labour Party agreeing that the only way forward in a post-war world was a mixed economy. Nationalisations of the core industries, iron, steel, etc., telecommunications, rail, would be brought under state ownership so that they're more efficient. A commitment, by nationalisation to full employment, a commitment to social welfare, so a cradle to the grave welfare system, including unemployment insurance and sickness insurance for all, and the creation of a national health service, free healthcare for everyone. Now, that was a crucial turning point for the Conservatives. We see this, this what we're calling kind of like paternalistic conservatism now. There could be, the Conservative leadership knew there could be no return to the sort of laissez-faire policies of the interwar years, there could be no return to the mass unemployment. So that, of course, it must be a crucial factor for why they stayed in power for so long. Other factors would include that the party machinery was reorganised by Rab Butler. Rab Butler, of course, was although he was never a Conservative Prime Minister, he was a crucial player behind the scenes, occupied different ministerial positions. It just meant, by party machinery, it's just the party became reorganised and more efficient. Became a much better organisation, to engage with the electorate. I think a really good factor here, of course, is the infighting and division in the Labour Party in opposition. So, Aneurin Bevan, of course, the architect of the welfare state, of the National Health Service, he was very much on the far left of the party, and then Hugh Gaitskell, who had been the Labour Chancellor, was very much on the moderate, on the right of the party. He even Gaitskell talked about abandoning Clause 4 of the Labour Party constitution, the commitment to nationalisation. He brought in prescription charges, and he was very, very. These factions in the Labour Party were very divisive, and as we've seen, any organisation to be successful, everyone needs to be pulling in the same direction. So those divisions most definitely cost them. You could also argue that the Conservatives benefited. They got lucky, didn't they? They managed. From 1951, they were in power, and within a few years, the economy had picked up, and rationing was brought to an end, and by the end of the 1950s, people were getting on the old Comet jet airliner and flying to the Mediterranean for their holidays. And Supermac, Prime Minister Macmillan even said to the British people, "You'd never had it so good," and absolutely right, people hadn't. So they did benefit from the global economic boom that really got going from the late 1950s. Now, of course, for counter arguments, you could argue, actually, you could really debate the extent to which the Conservatives dominated British politics, point to the 1951 election, which they won by the narrowest of margins. In fact, they lost the popular vote. It was only, again, because some constituencies perhaps were not represented as much as they should be, that didn't translate into seats in Parliament. So they came back into power by the narrowest margins. You could argue that they were beset by a series of national security failures. Macmillan had, exonerated Kim Philby in Parliament, and Philby turned out to be one of the Cambridge Five. He'd had very high positions in MI5 and MI6, and he was revealed to be a Soviet spy. Of course, the Profumo affair. in 1963, which forced eventually the resignation of Macmillan. You could argue that the Conservatives were politically a busted flush by this time, which is why Macmillan had to institute this brutal cabinet reshuffle that's known as the Night of the Long Knives, because there was this perception that the Conservative leadership were public school old men who were out of time and out of touch with the spirit of youth and the counterculture of the 1960s. So there's some good scope there to actually, put together some good counter arguments. Okay, the last question. Again, to have a go at planning. And social change came up, social change up to 1964 came up as an extract question in 2019. Every chance it could come up as an essay question. I think given, what's happened in the last few years with, the whole kind of debate around, Britain's history and slave ownership and the Windrush scandal in 2018, I think it was. So it is, it's quite topical. So they might go down that route. So the question thus states, immigration had the biggest impact on British society in the period from 1945 to 1964. How valid is that view? So factors to consider, of course, always start with the factor given to you in the question. You could say that immigration did have a massive impact on British society, not always a particularly pleasant one, because unfortunately of the racial tensions that it created. There were concerns that immigration was reaching, dangerously high levels by the late 1950s. So many of the subjects of the old British Empire, now the Commonwealth, were coming to, do a lot of the jobs that needed doing because of the labour shortage that resulted from, of course, the Second World War. This led, of course, the government to pass the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962. So there were violent clashes, there were mixed attitudes to immigration, and it has no doubt, it did transform British society. Other factors to include, equally valid, the breaking down of class barriers that had resulted from the Second World War. If you remember, particularly a lot of the children who became evacuees were so poor, and some of them hadn't even been toilet trained, and it did sort of lead to people of a more kind of affluent standing in life to kind of perhaps question their attitudes towards those less favourable. You could talk about, of course, the growth of affluence and consumerism. The consumer economy really got going. And that links in, of course, with new technology. Televisions were now, some households had televisions. The first computer systems were being used in the workplace. Then, of course, there's the changing position of women. And, you could argue that although women had won, certainly the same political rights as men, there was now the emphasis on getting those same rights in the workplace and equal pay, and breaking down traditional perceptions of women as mothers and housewives. You could also talk about, the cult of the teenager, the battles between the mods and the rockers. So there's lots to get into there. And as I say, this is something that's been under assessed. It's only come up as an extract question in 2019. Every chance it could come up as an actual essay. So it is one, I think, to be prepared for. And I've given you a couple of extracts here from that exam paper in 2019 that I was just talking to you about. So do have a go at, again, breaking down the core arguments, the main argument, the supporting arguments, and if applicable, the supporting evidence. I've also included some potential questions on Ireland. Ireland has been assessed a lot, but it does seem to keep coming up every other year. So it is one we need to be prepared for. So given that we've only a couple of weeks ago, finished a whole thematic study of Ireland. I don't want to spend too much time in this presentation going back over something that we only discussed a couple of weeks ago. But there's some good questions, quite challenging questions in there that gets you to think about British policy in Ireland. In the interwar years, obviously going into the partition, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and also looking at the effectiveness of British governments in Ireland from the period 1871 to 1894. So I'm just conscious of the fact that I'm recording this on a Monday evening. You're probably going to get this recording presentation, and you might get it tonight, you might get it tomorrow. Some of you are exams tomorrow. So I hope that it has helped you in some way, and it's helped kind of like to prepare you for some of the possibilities that could come up in the exam. I haven't got a crystal ball. We could look at past content, but as I said before, Ireland's come up quite a bit, but it continues to come up. The economy's come up numerous times, but it continues to come up. So just because something has been extensively assessed doesn't mean to say it's not going to come up in some form. So we don't know what's going to come up, but hopefully there's something in this presentation at the very least that's hopefully going to help you get through the exam on Wednesday. So as I say, I hope it's helped. Go and do your very, very best. That's all you can do. And we'll come back after half term and prepare for paper 2. Bye for now.